So I wanted to welcome everyone to this session that we're calling Evangelization and Secular Feminism, a Starting Place. My name is Falk Dalessio. I'm a Catholic theologian who currently works as a theology professor at the University of Dayton in Ohio. Before we start, I want to say, please note that this is being recorded, and also that we'll have a short time for Q&A at the end. These are sort of these great mini sessions that are challenging to somebody who normally teaches for an hour at a time. So hopefully whatever gets said here is sort of what God is hoping that I get out of my mouth. So welcome. A few words about me. I am, like I mentioned, I hold a Ph.D. in Catholic theology. I teach theology primarily to undergraduates. I also have done other sort of work in the community on panels or speak on things like Theology on Tap and stuff like that. I come from a ministry background and then kind of hit academia hard. My study has to do with theological anthropology, women, theological feminism, and sort of encountering feminist arguments from a Catholic perspective as well. So as a starting place, I want to add to the definitions of evangelization that we've already had by saying that my definition is something like bringing Jesus with us and making a safe and hospitable environment for other people. So another thing about me is people just talk to me. Like my mother used to do this, and my dad used to make fun of her. She'd be in the grocery store and she'd come out knowing someone's life story. Well, she was looking through eggs to make sure that they weren't shattered. And the same thing happens to me. So I don't know if that's genetic or if God has a sense of humor, but there is something about being that person that people talk to, even after barely having met, that for me is a great responsibility and has taught me so much about how much other people need to be heard and listened to and need a safe space, and trying to be sort of that safe space for them. That's a way that I can serve whoever is in my life at the moment or for a long term, and be able to sort of be Christ to them the best I can, even before we sort of get to that, right? So one of the things I want to start with, if we're talking about secular feminism, is that scholars use a definition of feminism that with an S at the end, that's feminisms. And this is actually really good for Catholics because it allows Catholics to also have a feminism and not have to fit a mold that we sort of automatically jump to. So John Paul II, as several of us may know, used this phrase new feminism in Evangelium Vitae, which is on the gospel of life. And in paragraph 99, he talks about this kind of need for a new a new feminism that looks different from the old ones. Explaining this to secular feminists is not going to fly. So I just want to start with that is we need to listen first before we're sort of going the next step. But living it is an option for Catholics. Consider the options. There is a group of women from St. Thomas University in Minnesota, and they have a meeting or group they call the Siena Symposium. And several of those women who are professional philosophers, Catholic philosophers, use a phrase called personalist feminism. So that's the one I've adopted actually as this new feminism, because John Paul II is really introducing a category and not a particular name of a feminism. So as a personalist feminist, I would say that person is not a means to an end, but also that the only appropriate response to the person is love. I'm not good at this, but that's at least sort of the approach I have to the most vulnerable, to women in the world and to other people. So that's an important kind of thing moving forward, that's a distinction that can fit into this realm of feminisms, even though it is directly counter to many of the forms of secular feminism that put the autonomous individual above the community or above other persons in a way that can often be based on a patriarchal model, even though it's women, which is part of our instinct against sort of secular feminism, as Catholics often. So the Catholic Church has spoken against sort of this evangelical instinct, which is the opposite of that, which is to keep women sort of at home and in a very closely sort of guarded place where their circle of influence, and this also comes from sort of 19th century Protestantism, and even as far back as Enlightenment, to keep women in sort of the sphere of influence that's only domestic. And that's not our baptismal call, right? So that really like bucks against this idea of go out to all the world and share the good news. And I just want to mention several of the popes in the last 50, 60 years, right? So Paul VI tells us that now is the hour of woman to practice her influence in the world. And he also is the one who made Teresa of Avila and Catherine of Siena doctors of the church, the first two women to be declared doctors of the church. And then John Paul II, as I mentioned, talks about this new feminism, and he also declared Therese of Lisieux to be a doctor of the church. So they're putting their money where their mouth is, you know. And then Benedict XVI is the first pope to put a woman in the curia, right? So Flaminia Giovanelli is the first woman undersecretary of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. It's a really big deal. And for all the sort of flack that Benedict sometimes gets, because I think people deeply misunderstand him, he is so pro-woman, he puts a woman in the curia. So he also, like his predecessors before him, declares Hildegard a doctor of the church. And so now we have 4 doctors of the church who are women, which is very significant. Even though it's not equal to how many men are doctors, it says that our popes and our shepherds are recognizing that there needs to be a very public understanding of the influence and the contributions of women in the doctrine and of the church, right? And sort of what we inherit, what we pass forward. Francis recently appointed the first female undersecretary to the Synod of Bishops, and this is a really big deal. Her name is Sister Natalie Beckwart, and she will have voting rights in the Synod. I'm talking about all this so that we have a sense, if we're Catholic, we have a sense of sort of where the church is actually being active in understanding the strengths and influences of women through the grace of God and through the grace of the sacraments, but also just in her very existence as image of God, right? And so we need to have kind of 2 pieces. The first one is, what does the Catholic Church say about women? Who are we? How does it resonate with us? How does that fit into the gospel and the good news that I feel compelled to share with the people around me? I am going to read a 4-sentence, fairly long sentences clip from Amoris Laetitia that tells us a little bit about sort of how, as Catholics, we need to be aware of the way that the feminist movement works. So everyone seems surprised that Francis put this couple of paragraphs actually that are quite well written on women in particular in the church and sort of this influence and the women's movement in particular into Amoris Laetitia. Usually we're talking about marriage and things like that, but it's in there. It's paragraph 54. So he says, there are those who believe, I'm going to read this, there are those who believe that many of today's problems have arisen because of feminine emancipation. This argument, however, is not valid. He says it is false, untrue, and a form of male chauvinism. The equal dignity of men and women makes us rejoice to see old forms of discrimination disappear, and within families there is a growing reciprocity. If certain forms of feminism have arisen, which we must consider inadequate, we must nonetheless see in the women's movement the working of the spirit for a clearer recognition of the dignity and rights of women. It's a pretty profound statement, right? That there are feminisms that are inadequate, but there's something there. The spirit has been working through women to be able to say there needs to be a clearer recognition of the dignity and rights of women. And the thing is that this, as we will talk about, really pings off of the instinct, the feminist instinct, the secular feminist instinct, right? So what's vital to the conversations that can develop between Catholic feminists and secular feminists and many different forms of feminisms has a lot to do with the relationship. It's one thing to just walk up to somebody and start to tell them what's wrong with their ideologies of the world, but you're not going to get an ear. People will be on the defensive. I mean, we know this, right? But after developing a relationship with that person, there may be a way in, and it takes time and it takes patience, and there is an art to it. And I think that it's a matter of discernment how and whether we engage in these conversations, and where we feel called, we need to do a little work. So I would say all evangelization occurs as a fruit of relationship. And this includes evangelization towards Christ and away from Christ, right? We can almost say there's sort of this anti-evangelistic movement as well. And those relationships are founded on trust. So we need to be open, we need to be vulnerable, we need to be able to hear people's angst and worries without just trying to fix them. We need to be able to do what Gaudium et Spes says and share the burdens with them. Just where they're at. So when we think of Christ in the Gospels, you know, Christ met people at their tables. They didn't come to his house. He met them at the well. He met them on the dusty streets. There's this Jesus movie from the 70s. I don't know what it was. I watched it as a child, and it's one of my very favorite scenes, and probably all of you know it. But trying to time myself and look at the chat. Sorry, I just got thrown off. And this movie, there's a scene in the beginning where Jesus is basically playing with something like a volleyball on the beach. I love this scene. I loved the scene as a child. I love the scene now, because at one point he gets hit in the head with the volleyball and he falls down and he pretends to be dead, and everyone gets freaked out. And but it's just a lovely moment of Jesus's humanity where he's sweating and playing with everybody and getting dirty and falling in the sand, and actually has a great sense of humor. And that's what relationships should look like. You don't start to trust someone until you know that they're safe, right? So I think that cultivating friendship and hospitality is really important, to be able to be open, to be able to join people where they're at, to let people ask questions and come to the truth, while also strewing sort of these crumbs for them to follow. I think that it's important to never underestimate accompaniment. Right? This is where Francis really leads us well. There's a common language of Catholics and secular feminists that I think we don't really understand, or, you know, I think our common language isn't just English, it's empathy, dignity, and social justice, especially through the rights of women who, along with men, are the image of God, right? And that last bit sort of comes later, but we can talk about dignity and social justice and empathy. It helps to discover the current uses of language, lingo that's shareable. So I always say to my students, if you don't understand a word in the sentence, you don't understand the sentence. So words like patriarchy and intersectionality and misogyny and victim blaming, these are words that are important to most contemporary feminists today. And so it's worth your time and effort to learn what they are and find out how you think about them. And this language use is really important because, again, if we recall Christ, Jesus talked about sheep and taxes and wine. Paul talked about athletics, bodies, a thief in the night. Catherine talked about fish, fire, and gardens, Catherine of Siena. Thea Bowman talks about the business of life, which is a very 20th century kind of thing. So language is really important, right? Our usual conversation isn't metaphors, but these are kind of rhetorical devices of bringers of the good news. Because if we don't speak a common language, then so much gets lost in translation. So starting there and being willing to do that. If I'm consciously speaking to secular feminists, then I want to do everything that I can do to use language that we both understand. Even though it means that I have to do some research and learn new things, the burden of the good news is actually on my shoulders and not theirs. So that's something to think about, is how do I take this joyful burden of the good news and share it in a way that means something to the people that I'm sharing with. Language gives us that common ground and helps us find topics that we can share. I do want to read a couple of little paragraphs here. One is from Evangelium Vitae 99, where John Paul II says, "It depends on women to promote a new feminism," I mentioned that, "which rejects the temptation of imitating models of male domination in order to acknowledge and affirm the true genius of women in every aspect of the life of society and overcome all discrimination, violence, and exploitation." So it affirms the true genius of women in every aspect of life of society and overcomes, this is the goal, all discrimination, violence, and exploitation. Now, if you just take that out of the context of a papal encyclical, that sounds awfully feminist to me. Amoris Laetitia goes on to say, again in paragraph 54, even though, I have bits and pieces of it, even though significant advances have been made in the recognition of women's rights and their participation in public life, in some countries much remains to be done to promote these rights. There's shameful ill treatment to which women are sometimes subjected, domestic violence, and various forms of enslavement, which rather than a show of masculine power are craven acts of cowardice. So strong words from Francis. There's a lack of equal access to dignified work and rules of decision-making. History is burdened by the excesses of patriarchal cultures that considered women inferior. These are Catholic words. These are important words about the dignity of the human person. This is where we start when we're talking to other Catholic women, to secular feminists, to people who don't understand how this works. Evangelization, though, avoids eye rolling and steamrolling. And evangelization is built on a foundation of compassion and hospitality. It responds to the idea of Gaudium et Spes, which is our pastoral constitution, that the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the people of the age are the joys and hopes and the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Bringing the good news to all women, the news of freedom and victory over sin, is a great work and a great privilege. And I'm looking at Susan asking me questions right in the middle of this because she wants me to think on my feet. But there is this odd dichotomy people want to make between being able to be feminist and being able to be Catholic Christian, right? So that there's secular feminism on one side and Catholic Christianity on the other. And what I want to say to that is there are places that current ideologies in secular feminism and current and forever doctrines of the Catholic Church are not going to agree. And the easiest one I can think of course, is the right to abortion or these kinds of related pieces. And those things are very difficult to navigate, and they're sort of not. That's not the first place that you have a conversation with somebody that you want to bring the good news to, because you have to have a relationship. You have to have a trust space. You have to be able to listen to their stories of sexual abuse, of rape, of pain, of wound, of whatever the problems are that they have either experienced in their own life or seen and empathized with in the lives of others that need healing, right? That, like Susan was saying, Christ brings healing. We need to be in sort of these places first. And those kind of arguments take a lot of time because they're so raw and they're so deep. So I recommend being able to listen, to listen to a person screaming about how the government has no right over my body and the church has no right over my body. I think that's a deep act of charity, as hard as it is. And then to be able to jump in when somebody says there needs to be empathy, and to be able to absolutely say, absolutely. there needs to be empathy for women who are struggling in this way. There needs to be empathy for the pain of things like abortion. There needs to be better government, whatever. There needs to be more conversation in the church. There needs to be healing, right? But often you don't get to those conversations. At least I don't get to those conversations for 6 months or a year, right? And I think that that's the starting place. The starting place is that listening. The starting place is that being open to being Christ, even though and always when it means having to listen to very hard things. Because when people are in pain, or even when people are in denial or they're angry or any of these kind of things, we have the grace to love despite that. And so I think personalist feminism, these things I'm talking about, maybe aren't an antidote to secular feminism, but a way for us to respond and bring the good news, even if it takes kind of one step at a time. So I'm reading a couple of questions because we have about 4 minutes for questions. Yeah, I mean, okay, so Kristen Johnson is asking about, or mentioning that there's sort of this medical establishment that is controlling women's bodies by stopping their feminine features as though femaleness is bad. Yeah, great, I agree with you, right? But that's not going to help you talk to a secular feminist about Jesus, right? I think that the problem is that what we do is we kind of have all of these instinctual arguments against very real, established, kind of heavily funded social practices that are stripping us of our femininity, or that threaten the reality of the goodness of plain old womanhood, right? Of being created in God's image as woman. Those are the later conversations. Those are not the first conversations. That's really what I want to say. If we're talking about a starting point to speaking to feminists and to secular feminists, the first point is more along the lines of, how do I bring Christ to you and love you? And then we'll get to those conversations when I have your trust, right? So I think, yeah, and Kristen, you're making a great point, and I think we have a lot of those points, but I'm going to put that in the same category as abortion. These are questions and these are arguments to have that we need to come into them with empathy and compassion. And I just don't know that we're ever going to get anywhere in these dialogues if we don't create real space for real dialogue. I just want to scroll and see. We've got 2 more minutes. Somebody cancels your phone service and talks about Jesus. That's awesome. And sometimes that happens to me. Yeah, Deborah Savage is fantastic. I helped write a book with her, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity. There are some really good books out before, since I have 2 minutes and no one's asking questions. Yeah, Jesus at the Woman of the Well. I mean, Saint Fatina, right? Like this is an amazing story and an amazing opportunity for us to sort of model after. There are groups online that I would love to recommend to you. One is called FemCatholic. It's mostly geared towards women under 35 or 40. It's a woman named Samantha Pavlak. She's sort of talk about letting your feminine genius shine. It covers a lot of conversations between sort of secular feminism and what it means to be a Catholic feminist. So it's just FEM Catholic. You can find it on Facebook for sure. There's another group that I'd like to recommend that is not Catholic, that is called New Wave Feminists. And you can find them on Facebook as well, and probably on the web, but I'm not sure because I follow her on Facebook. And then her name is Destiny Hernan de la Rosa. bright purple hair, and spends her life committed as an agnostic, but surrounded by Catholics, to the pro-life movement, and the language that they use has changed my students' lives as well as other people. So I'd like to sort of recommend that. All right, so we are out of time. That was super quick, and I want to recommend that you go over to And Then God Gave Me a Timeout by Donna Heckler. Have a great day.